y'all, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Samantha Leighanne and I talk about books. Today we're doing April. Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm bulk filming and April is absolutely murdering me. Okay, so the month of April. April, I started reading historical fiction and couldn't stop. That's all right. Sometimes we just need to change the pace, right? So here we are. In the month of April, I read 10 books. That equates to 3,870 pages. That does include Kindle pages for audiobooks, just by the way, just saying. For formatting, I read 5 physical books, 5 physical books, 5 audiobooks, no ebooks this month, and 3 of those were from the library. So, genre breakdown, we have 4 historical fiction, 1 fantasy, 3 horror, 1 contemporary, and 1 thriller. I'm so behind on reviewing. Oh my God. So I wanted to read more from my shelves for the month of April. The very first book that I picked up, because I just got in my head that I wanted historical fiction, Confessions of Young Nero by Margaret George. I read Helen of Troy by Margaret George and didn't love it, but I have 4 of her books on my shelves. Why I did that, I will never know, because I didn't love Helen of Troy and I sure shit did not love Confessions of Young Nero. If you're familiar with Nero, he was pretty much hated by historians for various reasons. But in this book, there are a lot of things that are written about Nero that were apparently untrue in terms of historical inaccuracies, like the fact that he danced as Rome burned or something like that. Apparently that wasn't true, as well as a plethora of other things. So it was very obvious that in writing this book, Margaret George was trying to make Nero more sympathetic. Did she succeed? No, because I gave 0 fucks about Nero or anything that happened in that story. There was this really disgusting incestual element, which I was not a fan. Not a fan at all. I was bored. There was nothing compelling about Nero as a character or as a person. I get what she was trying to do, but I think she failed at it. She didn't make him relatable. I just didn't give a fuck, if we're being honest. Just point blank period, I just did not give a fuck. That said, there's apparently a second part, this is a duology, I guess. It's young Nero and then it's Nero, I don't know. Him as an adult or whatever. I have no intention of reading that. So literally the most compelling thing about this book were there were these little bitty tiny chapters that had to do with a poisoner that worked for Nero's mother at one point. And that was the most interesting thing about the book. And when I tell you those were minute chapters, because this boy was thick, yeah. We are unhauling, and I honestly, if that's how she writes historical fiction, I want drama, I want intrigue. I know it's all bullshit, but I still want to be entertained. So that said, I probably will end up unhauling all of her books that I have. I think I have 2 more in there. That's okay, nothing wrong with that. Moving on. Next up, my library hold came in for this, and that's Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas, which is a Peter Pan retelling. I read Cemetery Boys and absolutely loved it so much. This one, not as much. It was still fine. I feel like there was a really large difference in the writing in between this book and Cemetery Boys. The writing was not as fluid. The characters, it wasn't that they were underdeveloped, but the dialogue I think needed some work. And I actually found out afterwards that Lost in the Neverwoods was actually written before Cemetery Boys. It's just Cemetery Boys got published first. So it makes a lot of sense if this was the first book that Thomas actually wrote. I've never read a Peter Pan retelling that I can personally recall. I don't particularly love Peter Pan all that much in general. So while this book was very just okay for me, if you're a fan of Peter Pan and Peter Pan retellings, then I would say that this is 100% the book for you. Like I said, it was very okay. I wasn't super wowed by it, but I also didn't hate it. I don't think that there's anything really to talk shit about it. It just wasn't necessarily something that I fell in love with. So there's that. Next up, I actually listened to this through Libro FM. I got this a while back, and I actually got it after I listened to Bethany, from Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Yeah, she absolutely loved it. And so I was like, all right, well, it's wasn't like I had looked at it and I had looked into maybe reading it, and I read the synopsis and I was like, I don't know. And then she talked about it and I was like, shit, I'll give it a shot. Why not? I actually ended up really liking it a lot. This almost felt like historical fiction in a way, but there were horror elements to it, and it took place in a fantasy location, if that makes any sense. But there were a lot of things that were discussed in this book that I thought was handled very well, and I really enjoyed it. The author pulled a lot of nuance into the issues that she was trying to discuss. It was very evident the things that she was trying to talk about without being too preachy, and without like taking you out of the story. So she absolutely nailed that. And there were so many things to discuss. She managed to discuss religion, social class, gender roles, racism, and racial identity as well. The discussion of all of these things, but she did it so well. I really enjoyed like the actual story as a whole. And apparently this is the beginning of a series. So I'm actually really interested to finish reading the series. So next I picked up The Night Tiger, which this was another historical fiction. Almost fantasy. Don't want to call it magical realism because I'm not sure that it qualifies as magical realism, but it's similar in style, if that makes any sense. I liked her first book, The Ghost Bride, and so I was pretty confident that I would also like this. Very similar in tone and style. And in this particular story, there was a really great balance of like the history of the area as well as the magic. The characters themselves were all very compelling. I was invested in each and every one of them, what their backstories were, where they were going. I loved that because there was a pretty decent cast of characters. Each of the storylines wove together and they interconnected beautifully. Sometimes it's really hard to, when you have a cast that's that large, it's hard to make them all connect in a seamless way, and she did that very beautifully. There's a good deal of Malay history within this book, and that was very interesting because it was something that I was very unfamiliar with, as well as how colonization affected the area and their customs and their religions and all of those types of things as well. The supernatural and magic elements wove into the story perfectly, and really helped bring like the culture itself to life, I felt like. One of the things that I actually liked is they never came out and expressly explained the Night Tiger. So you were kind of left to draw your own conclusions, I guess, of which you could draw several different ones. Because I kind of went back and forth on like exactly what I thought had happened within the story. But I liked that. I like things that are open to our own interpretation. And so I appreciated that aspect of it a lot. This is her second book. And so I feel like she's just going to continue to get better as she writes. So I definitely think that she's an author to watch. Next, once again, we're picking up more books from our shelves, and we picked up Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I went to this because after I was so disappointed by Confessions of Young Nero, which is technically historical, but they talk a lot about Greek gods and goddesses and, things of that nature. Just that whole time period, ancient Rome, made me crave something grounded in European and Greek mythology. And so that's why I decided to go ahead and reach for Silence of the Girls. I read Song of Achilles a couple of years back and absolutely loved it so much. It was wonderful. And this is basically the story of Achilles, but told from the perspective of Briseis, who was one of his slaves that he earned from sacking a city, whatever city she's from. I can't remember which one it was. There were a lot of times that this book was hard to read, but it was really good. I feel like when we talk about the Trojan War, like pretty much the only thing that we talk about are the heroes, or Achilles and Patroclus, and that's really what we talk about. But it really made me look at the women of the Trojan War in a very different way. It talks a lot about slaves, and she went from basically being the queen of the city that she was in to being the slave to a man who basically slayed her husband and her whole family, and how that feels, what that's like. Another thing that the author did was make Achilles extremely unsympathetic, which I think is deserving when you really and truly look at the circumstances of the Trojan War. So it was refreshing to read a story that doesn't focus on the heroes of the Trojan War, but more on the people that were truly affected by it, and the people who were affected by the pride of the men that were involved in this war. So again, there's a lot of trigger warnings in this one for pretty much any kind of sexual assault that you can think of, but overall I really enjoyed it and I would 100% recommend. Immediately after that, I wanted more. Like, I loved that and I wanted more. So I went searching through the internet to find something similar, and I came across 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. I had never heard of this before. I ended up getting it off Audible, and I also really liked this because it was another sort of retelling, but through the different eyes of the different women in the Trojan War. There were a lot of figures that I was somewhat familiar with, just from the limited knowledge that I have of Greek mythology. Hecate, Chryseis, Briseis, Penelope, who was Odysseus's wife, and Iphigenia. There was also Gaia, the mother of the world, and Calliope as well. But it basically took you through each of these women and talked about the sacrifices that they made, and then kind of also went into the actual gods and goddesses, and talked about how the war even came to be. And so that was really interesting because, you know, everybody's like, oh, Paris stole Helen and that's how the Trojan War started. And yes, that is true. But it dove into the mythology of exactly why that was a thing that happened. And so I did really enjoy that aspect of it. But I definitely recommend it. I think I gave it like 3.5 stars. If you're not a fan of like multiple points of view, then this probably isn't going to be the book for you. But if you don't mind that sort of thing, then I would read it. Next, I read Survivor Song by Paul Tremblay, and this I blew through so quickly. This has been on my shelf for a minute, and this is another pandemic story. Did not know that whenever I picked it up. But talk about suspense. It reads so quickly. I finished it in like a day and a half, I think. I really, really enjoyed it. It was like I ended up getting to the end and like teared up at the end, but like it grabbed you at the beginning and it did not fucking let up. And the anxiety that I felt while I was reading this was crazy. It isn't very often that books will actually like make me anxious while I'm reading them, and this succeeded in doing that very, very well. And I loved it. I really did. I think Paul Tremblay has such a great way of storytelling, in including things that will horrify you, but also including things that will make you feel like real emotion. And that's one of the reasons that I love his writing so much. It's one of the reasons that I loved Head Full of Ghosts, you know, Cabin at the End of the World. He definitely displayed that same sort of writing. And then also same thing with Disappearance at Devil's Rock, which there is a connection to Disappearance at Devil's Rock, and I like screamed when I realized that. So that was great. But I gave this one 5 stars. I really loved it. Definitely anxiety inducing as far as the whole pandemic. The idea of a rabies on steroids that can absolutely demolish the person that you are within an hour is absolutely horrifying. And then also looking at the things that we do for the people that we love, what a mother would do for her unborn baby, all of these different things. Like it was very, very good. I really, really loved it. And from the reviews that I saw, either people loved it or they hated it. But I feel like that's in general Paul Tremblay's writing. Like people either love it or they hate it. So I happen to love it. Next, we went back to historical fiction and we picked up The Black Isle by Sandy Tan. I didn't love this one, but I didn't hate it. But I really didn't love it. So this is a historical fiction with a paranormal twist, okay? And it takes place on, I believe, a fictional island, but it's in like the Malaysian area. And I'm fairly certain that it is a parallel for Singapore. You have a woman or a girl who discovers at a young age that she can see ghosts, and she can communicate with ghosts, and it kind of takes you through her life and how that skill has affected her and the people around her and the decisions that she has made. There's also a deep study on colonialism in that area, which is another thing that we saw in Night Tiger. And these do take place in very similar locations. So it was interesting to see another perspective on that as well. I struggled with the pacing in this one a good deal. There were times where I felt like we weren't really getting anywhere, and it took me, I mean, I can usually knock a book out. A long time for me to knock a book out is 4 days, and I think I spent over a week reading this. I really kind of struggled my way through this, and it just had to do with the pacing, because I didn't dislike the story, I didn't dislike the characters, just the pacing felt like it dragged a little bit. But again, it was a great study on Singapore and the effects of colonialism and things of that nature. So there were definitely some hard to read parts. But overall, it was a decent story. Like, I gave it 3 stars. I probably wouldn't read it again if we're being completely honest, but I would recommend it if you're looking for a Western historical fiction that isn't necessarily centered around, the war. So next, I picked up the Sanatorium by Sarah Pierce. My hold came in for the library for this. And this was another book that I had seen a massive amount of hype around. The Sanatorium, it's in this remote part of a European country, like the Swiss Alps or something along those lines. And this old tuberculosis sanatorium is being turned into a hotel. And this woman is going to meet her brother for his engagement party or something. And they have their own family history, whatever. And then somebody shows up dead. And then another person shows up missing. And things start happening. I had high hopes for this and was left pretty disappointed by it. I read this very, very quickly. So it reads quickly. The first third was good, and then the last 2/3, it was just like, okay. Again, we have an element of predictability, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, again, we talked about this. But I don't know, I just wasn't invested. It really, I wish that I could say exactly why that book didn't work for me, because when you look at it like on paper, it should have worked. But I don't know, it didn't compel me in the way that I wanted it to. And so this was another one that I was really glad that I didn't pay for, like, because I feel like I would have been really upset had I actually paid for it, because I would never read it again. I don't know that I would recommend it. Like, I've seen it hyped, but I don't know, it just didn't work for me. I had really high hopes. It wasn't it. So I don't really have much else to say. It's a thriller, so I don't like to give too much away on plot. So sorry I'm not able to articulate that very well, but it is what it is. And the very last book that I read for the month was my contemporary, and that was The Wonder Boy of Whistle Stop. I'm about as Southern as they come, honestly. Born and raised in South Carolina. I don't think that I have too much of an accent. You guys can sound off on that in the comments below. On whether or not you think I do. But if you've ever seen the film Fried Green Tomatoes, which I love, it's one of my favorite films of all time. It's wonderful. And I read the book last year and I loved it. It was so good. It's one of the best adaptations that I think I've ever seen as far as like book to film. They did an excellent job, but I digress. I saw that Fannie Flagg, the writer of Fried Green Tomatoes and the Whistle Stop Cafe, had written not necessarily a sequel to Fried Green Tomatoes, but had characters from the story in a new story. We're revisiting some of those characters. Great, right? I was apprehensive at first. I really was. I was apprehensive because I wasn't sure if it was just going to be like a cash grab and we weren't going to enjoy it. I've seen mixed reviews about it. After I finished it, I went through and I read some reviews, and some people did feel that the non-linear format of the story just didn't work for them. In the way that the story is set up, you have Bud, who was in Fried Green Tomatoes, and it's kind of his life and his daughter's life. And we're going back and forth in between old stories of Whistle Stop and then the new stories of Ruthie, which is Bud's daughter, and what her life is like now. There is a connection that happens between Ruthie and Evelyn, you know, all of the characters from the first book, not all of them, but a lot of them from the first book. All of it comes together, and it's just like, it was so wholesome and so heartwarming. And I didn't realize until I had finished it, like, how much I really needed that comfort. Like, it was very comforting to me, those stories and those characters where they were familiar, they were comforting, and I just really, really loved it. If you are a fan of the first book, like, I would recommend reading it. I really liked it. It was really nice to kind of revisit that, and it was a really good note to end on as far as reading for April, and it kind of set me up for May. Just like, it was just a really good note to end on, so I did really enjoy it. So those are the books that I read in the month of April. It was a pretty good reading month. There were a couple duds in there, but for the most part, it was a pretty good reading month, so I'm happy with it. Have you read any of these books? If you have, comment down below and let me know what you thought of them. Remember to keep it spoiler free in the comments. If you want to talk spoilers, you can always message me on Twitter, Goodreads, and Instagram. All of my socials are found in the down bar below. There is also a plethora of links on different variety of ways that you can support me if you so desire to do so. If this is your first time here, hi, hello, and welcome. We talk about books here, and if you like what you see and you want to see more, you can click thumbs up. You can hit subscribe if you haven't already. You can also click the little bell notification to see when I do upload videos. So next, we have a recommendations video for horror short story collections by a single author that it do not include King. That's the only thing that I have currently like filmed. So that is a thing. I am working on King Chronicles. I am working on the Dark Tower series. So those are also things that I am working on. I also have a fun video in the works. So, but yeah, if there's anything that you guys would like to see in the upcoming future, please comment down below and let me know what those things might be. Otherwise, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you guys so very much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye.